Nous allons donc...
So we're now going to continue our meeting. We have run quite a bit later than anticipated, but we will rely on our chairs to try and accelerate things. As I said to Xavier, quite often we run late. The only thing we need to bear in mind is the canteen closes at 2 o'clock, and we need to refuel. We need to be able to sit down and eat before the afternoon's activities. So we will try and wrap up the morning session before the canteen closes. So now we're going to launch our panel, chaired by Mario Pezzini, who is the director of the OECD Development Center. And this is the panel entitled
Challenge the way poverty is measured. What is the way forward? Donc, en quoi cette recherche nous amène à reconsidérer la façon dont les pistes pour le futur.
So I will now give the floor to Mario to chair that session.
Good moment to discuss. We have an excellent participant in the panel, and I think we can continue the interaction with a beautiful starting of this conference. I found it extremely interesting. Let me introduce first the people that are around the table. We have the pleasure to have with us Jean-Luc Tavernier, which is the Director General of INSEE. INSEE is the House of Statistics in France. So, for those that don't know, and he has been the owner of the statistics for some years now, but before he has a long experience in using statistics as he was working in the Ministry of Economy, the Treasury, the Ministry of Budget, the Central Agency for Social Security, so not only hard economic data, the Ministry of Labor, and other things. So for sure here we have a very qualified contribution. Close to Jean-Luc, we have Dean Yolife, which is the lead economist in the Development Data Group of the World Bank, member of the Living Standards Measurement Study team, and expert in everything related to poverty measurement. He was also adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins. I want to underline that point because I was at that university as well, so we have been maybe colleagues without knowing. And he was also starting the work in the Economic Research Service, ERS, famous department of the US Department of Agriculture. This is the area where people work on rural development. That I think is a very important dimension in our discussion. Then we have Corinne Mitchell, which is working in the policy and outreach of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. So Corinne, continue in this panel the discussion that has been introduced before. And last but not least, we have Marco Miradercoli, which is head of division for household statistics and progress. And guess what? Many decades ago, we were studying at the same university. We were sharing with other four the same apartment, but he was clearly the most intelligent among us. So we have a privilege to have him here with us. Now, what are we going to discuss in this moment? I was very impressed, as I said, for all the discussion this morning and the way in which the methodology, the way in which the work has been done in this very excellent activity. I was also impressed by Ruth when Ruth invited us to use psychological and sociological category in the analysis, and in particular in the condition of poor. Now, I think that following that suggestion, I was thinking, how much can we apply those categories in the approach that economists have in respect of the phenomenon, not only the perception that the poor have of their condition, but the way, the lenses through which we look at the poor. And almost immediately I tended to conclude that with the exception of all the economists that are here around the table, in general, the category, the group of professionals are sick by a specific form of sickness that I would call a professional obsessionality. In fact, our relationship with the otherness is probably one of the worst, I think, that we can probably identify. Reduction to number, reduction to distance, elite towards people, and many other facts that in these days appear in France, but also in other contexts, are very typical of our category. And to describe it, I will quote very quickly 3 jokes that introduce a little bit the debate among us. The first is from the alma mater of Dean. He comes from Princeton University, and there Albert Hirschman conducted several works. And speaking about development, the issue on which I am working, so I work mainly what Robert calls the global south. I don't know where it stops, but anyway, the global south. So Hirschman used to call, to tell this joke. 2 people meeting each other, and one goes, Paul, what's happening to you? It has been 10 years we didn't see each other, but you were small, now you are big. You were fat, now you are thin. And the other goes, sorry, but my name is not Paul. So you have changed so much, even the name. I think that for long we have seen the issue of poverty and the issue of dealing with development as synonymous. And practically, just to brutalize and to be clear among ourselves, I think that the vision that we had was that poverty was a phenomena concentrated in the least developed countries, and what we have to do was to collect money to send there, and by compensating the condition of the income of poor, moving them up the line of extreme poverty. Because once done that, the marked, beautiful, automatic mechanism would have kept definitely for the rest of humanity the people outside extreme poverty. Obviously, I'm making things very schematic, but I think that that vision was obviously wrong. We have to revise. We know that today, large part of extreme poverty calculated in traditional way is not concentrated necessarily in the least developed country, is in middle-income countries like India or Bangladesh or other countries. So a lot has happened in the last years. 83 countries had a GDP per capita more than the double of the OECD average. And these have a name. Obviously, we remember China, India, but they can be called Chile or Ethiopia, and so on. So this world has changed. Can we continue to use the same vision and category? Can we say that the problem of poverty is simple? We get together the money, we ship, and everything will be done? Second joke about the economists. It is about 2 economists that are talking to each other, but in particular, one every 5 seconds claps the hand. That says, what are you doing? I'm clapping the hand. But why? And to keep the crocodile away. So, but we are in Paris, there are no crocodile. So it does work. And more or less, that's what we have continuously done. We continuously thought that the issue was income, and we have to treat that issue. And when something else was happening, it didn't enter in our screen and our thought. The third example is more known, is the person that is looking the key under the light, not because he lost the key there, he lost very far, but that's the place where the light is, and so I look into the light. Why I think this is important? Because in our policy work, we continue to be oriented in a sectoral and not multidimensional way, because every bureaucrat pretends that his minister is the most important, and therefore we have to deal with those policies to solve the things. These are just example of a professional obsessionality that I think you are helping us to break. And we should do much more work to go in that direction. Now, in order to reflect on all those things, I am going to ask some questions to the participant of this panel. And obviously, I will start with Monsieur Tavernier, because I would like to know how in the INSEE, you measure la grande pauvreté in a rich country like France. Give us an example. Are you integrating all these other dimensions, or at least part, or is more a traditional way, the one in which you measure? We agreed before, during the coffee and the other things that you do in a break, and the point was that we will have question and answer relatively quick, so not long question, in order to interact. So, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Merci beaucoup. Bonjour.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. How do we measure poverty? Obviously, I'm talking from the point of view of a European country that has quite a developed statistical infrastructure. In particular, we have questionnaires, we have face-to-face interviews, we have quite lengthy surveys that we run with households concerning living conditions, working conditions, feelings of security, health, and so on. No doubt we will come back to the dimensions that we can work on further. But when it comes to the definition of poverty, because words have a meaning, I believe that we should continue to define poverty as material deprivation, either in terms of income or in terms of material lack, and we should identify it by asking people questions about the privations that they suffer. We can also ask households questions about their perceptions. Do you feel poor? One thing that's interesting to see is that these three kinds of measurement, monetary poverty, living conditions poverty, and perceptions, can correlate, but they don't necessarily correlate exactly. Some people will tell you that they feel poor, even when objectively speaking they are not on those other measures, and vice versa. And we realize that this complexity exists. But to come back to the chairman's introduction, the difficulty that we are confronted with as a statistical office is not grasping the complexity of the situation, but rather transmitting that to public opinion. I'll give you an example. In INSEE, since I've been there, I've been asking the teams never to publish the poverty rate, or at least to publish it as little as possible, when or to publish in association with an assessment of what poverty means. So when you talk about people who are so many percent below the average, it gives you a rate, but give them the intensity of poverty, because that is a better measurement of major poverty, because it gives you a better idea of how far people are away from the average in terms of those measurements. The intensity of poverty is different from whether people are just above or just below the poverty line. But despite all of our efforts, when we publish our poverty rates, most of the newspapers, and that's 95% of them, only give the poverty rate and don't talk about poverty intensity. So it's very difficult to separate that tendency out from our work as statisticians. It's not just the way you present figures as a statistician, it's also the way that you educate public opinion. You make the public able to grasp the complexity that's reflected in your statistics. All right, thank you very much. And if we could continue.
And we say, okay, therefore, we see that the statistical institution tend to introduce other elements. There is a rigidity in the communication means that they want the number. I want the number because I want to go on the first page by saying and showing things and so on, which is a problem, obviously. What is happening in international organizations like the World Bank? Several times we heard this morning that what matters is also the voice of the poor. That means the voice of the people in reality. And we see that this claim for voice is reappearing in many instances in these days, in developing countries as well as in this country, for example. And so what about the voice of the poor? Were you capable to capture it? Dean.
Well, thanks very much. And first, just let me say that I feel very grateful to be invited today to come and to listen and learn. I think the work that's been done to date reflects an impressive amount of knowledge gained and summarized in a very useful way. And I can also see a very sort of clear work agenda looking forward with many challenges and many interesting questions to handle. And I think the question that you're posing of what does it mean to listen to the voices of the poor, when we start drilling down into the issues of how do we start and go to have conversations with people in kind of a systematic way so that we can listen to them and start measuring them on these different concepts is going to be a real challenge. And I think the first step in measuring things is defining concepts. And then the next step is trying to construct the instruments that are going to measure these concepts. And my background is more on the material deprivation side. And while that seems fairly simple to some people as a concept, defining the instruments to measure that is extremely challenging, and we're continually humbled by how small changes and how we ask questions matter a lot in terms of how we measure these things. And so when I hear this notion of listening to the voices of the poor, I think it's going to be really important to just acknowledge that it's going to take a lot of work moving forward in terms of continued thinking about how things get translated across cultures, across languages, thinking about things. So in particular, I heard a lot of words about shame and exclusion. And if I think about, there are many things I'm ashamed of, and these are things I don't want to talk about. And so finding the right questions to get me to talk about the things I'm ashamed of is going to be challenging. And then to start to score these and rank these is going to be an interesting challenge. And then I suppose a slightly different challenge would be with exclusion. I'm sure there are things that I'm excluded from, even in my privileged life, but I don't know what they are, and I won't be able to start articulating those. Well, certainly as you move down, that's probably true of most people, that the things that we're excluded from, we might not even be fully cognizant of this. Certainly some things we are aware of, but there are many things we aren't. And so thinking about those types of questions will be really challenging. So I think that's one really important dimension. And then I'll just make one quick additional comment that I think we struggle with a lot in the way that we're dealing with data collection now and measuring even, well, the different forms of deprivation. And another is when we talk about voices of the poor, we're always going out and we're collecting a small group of people who are meant to reflect the entire population. And the statisticians sort of help us define how we can collect a sample that's representative of some population. But the statistics only helps us to do that, to reflect the population of those people who are counted. And essentially that's in census data. There are many, many people who aren't in census data, and there are many people who slip out of samples. And these are people like the homeless, for example, are excluded from these things. But oftentimes, even in our samples, we exclude people who are in conflict areas where we're not willing to take the risk of sending enumerators out to conflict areas. And that's going to be a huge element of this work program, is thinking about how we capture those people. So I just think there's a lot of exciting and challenging work going forward, and sort of putting down and really getting to colloquial phrases, the nuts and bolts of what it means to hear voices of the poor.
Thank you, Dan. Now, all these things are about measuring how we can do it, how it's done, and so on. But if we are capable to measure, these measures change or would change the assessment of the progress that we have made worldwide in eradicating extreme poverty. What I'm saying is, when we look at the big trends and at the global level, one point that is very often recalled is there are hundreds of millions of extreme poor that have been reduced in the last 2 decades because of the development of China, the development of India, and so on. But if we use those measures, more complex measures, would we come, Corinne, to the same results? Or do you think that the picture would be different?
So first I'll say that this is a research project that we're currently working on updating, so I don't have the final results now. but we've previously done work on this using our global multidimensional poverty index, which is a measure of material deprivation. And what we found is that over the years, multidimensional poverty has decreased, but that the decrease has been both in the incidence of poverty, so the percentage of people who are poor, and the intensity of poverty, so how poor those poor people are. However, it has not always been pro-poor, meaning that there are some subnational regions or population subgroups that are being left behind. When we compare it to the monetary poverty reduction that we see in different countries, we find that it does not always match, that there are some countries that have had large reductions in $1.90 a day poverty that have not reduced multidimensional poverty, and vice versa. And we also don't find a relationship with growth of GDP per capita. So I think that this is a complementary measure that can hopefully provide more information in addition to those more traditional measures of poverty reduction.
You don't find relation with GDP per capita? No. That's an important story. I remember a professor that used to say that looking only at the GDP per capita to discuss about the condition of people would be like if you go to see a doctor and he asks you only one data, your weight. I don't like the data. Personally, I don't know what do you think about that, but I don't like it. That's very important. Now, it's difficult, obviously, measuring. Speaking to my brothers from Bolivia, I remember very well a very important song of Atahualpa Yupanqui, Yo tengo tantos hermanos que no lo puedo contar. It's obviously very difficult to measure those things. But let's ask Marco, that is working in the OECD, to figure out alternative indicators, and he has been leading the work also on well-being indicator, how these measures that we are discussing here challenge the traditional measures of poverty. We have seen GDP is very challenged, but not only.
It challenges very strongly in the sense that, as a statistician, I would have a hard time to think about where to start to give operational meaning to some of the concepts that have been put forward. But to some extent, I think the issue of how you operationalize can get different connotation if you take in a very narrow sense, which is about counting. We heard in the opening speech about the effect that reducing the issue of poverty to account, the effect that it may have also about how poor people are themselves perceived. If the issue was one of counting, the challenges would be huge, because basically we would need, as a statistician, have survey questions for all of the 9 dimensions that have been put on the floor. We would have to pilot those things, understand if people are able to understand what they're asked, what are the meaningful measurement scale for reporting, where you put the limit, how you aggregate, all the type of things that the colleagues in the office to some extent are already doing when they do the multi-dimensional measure. But in my view, it is a narrow way of thinking about operationalizing the research finding. I think that, and it is my main takeaway from the beautiful presentation and moving presentation that has been done later on, is that, these 9 dimensions that have been put forward, they belong to different fields. And I think that there is an advantage in keeping them separate, because it provides a way towards giving operationalization of content to some of these aspects. On one side are the deprivation, which are what statisticians are probably more at ease about doing. It is an issue of putting a line and separating the poor from the non-poor, with all the complexity that we mentioned before. In my view, something that is very important that is put on the floor by the project are the experiences of poverty. When it comes to experiences, you can think that the issue is not necessarily an issue of counting, but also of addressing population that you have already identified with instrument that allows to make them talk about their life, what they've been, their experiences that they confront in their daily life. Martin already mentioned earlier this morning that one of the main areas of our work since the release of the Stiglitz-Senfitussi Commission was to look at the type of measure that psychologists have been using for many years to report about their evaluations of life, but also to their experiences, their affect, the negative and the positive. Some of the, we released a few years ago a set of recommendations to statistical offices for measuring those effects, which includes things like depression, worry. They can be not the type of more extreme type of experiences that the poor face in their life, but could well think about instruments that are specifically addressed towards people in those conditions. And this could be instruments that even civil society organizations, those that are providing services to the poor, providing shelter, providing meals, could more systematically ask about people they get in touch with. The second important aspect is the relational. And one aspect that I think is very important and for which I think statisticians would have a way of meaningfully referring and contributing is how the non-poor look at the poor. And I think the point that the important point is that somehow changes in how the non-poor look at the poor can increase much the burden that is put on them. And there is a little wonderful book written by a sociologist, an English sociologist who founded Open University in the 50s, which is called The Rise of Meritocracy, who makes the case that meritocratic society, where those who succeeded think that they deserve all the things that they've earned, while those who didn't make it are people that failed all the opportunities that are given. Are changing the ways and they are looking at people in all society. And in a sense, they are even more heavier in their judgment about relative to society, where instead, for example, the privilege is not earned in scare quote, as was said earlier, but comes from the accident of birth. I think statisticians should think systematically about more systematically measuring people's views, the non-poor's view about the nature of poverty. To some extent is what our ELS colleagues started doing with their survey about the risk that matters. They asked people, do you think that poverty is a matter of luck, lack of luck, or other things? There are countries where the majority of people think that poverty is a result of laziness. Even in the United States, there is close to 45% of people that report that their prevalent view about poverty, and they have a very clear different by income level. So I think more systematically collecting those type of measures, I think would be one way of bringing in these relational aspects.
Great. I told you he is very intelligent from the university. So now, Jean-Luc, we have heard already appearing in the discussion the question of sans-abri, homeless, and also how they are measured and so on. I know that in INSEE you have conducted work on sans-abri. What does appear from this category, the risk to escape completely from statistics, and what these statistics are telling us? But then I want to take also advantage of giving the floor to you for a second question. I group them. Mm-hmm. And the second is, maybe you don't know that France, the larger border with another country that France has is with Brazil. Strange enough, that's a piece of France that is there. Now, which means that France is very differentiated inside. And our discussion is, up to now, mentioning numbers that represent the national situation, so in a certain sense, averages. How do you deal with the fact that as countries are so differentiated, you have to measure poverty within a country also in comparing situations that are very different in themselves?
And may I ask a question you didn't ask?
Yeah.
May I answer a question you didn't ask? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Alors.
So regarding homelessness, we carried out a study The latest edition was in 2012. It was a very in-depth study of not only homeless people, but people who were homeless and people who had no stable residence. Homeless people are 10% of this population, people who live in hotels or in shelters, but who have no stable housing. Now, it is essential to study these people who are very difficult to reach out to with our conventional household surveys. But we can't completely ignore the fact, as statisticians, the fact that poor populations are harder to reach out to for studies because their existence is less stable. In the EU Living Conditions survey, these are panel surveys, so we have several interviews with the same household over different periods of their life. And what we see is that there are poverty traps, people who become trapped in poverty. Poverty is not a situation you can get in and out of easily. Now, of course, there is more attrition. That's a statistical term for people who are poor than for people who are not as poor. So it was a real challenge for us to carry out this study on homelessness. It's a very difficult study because we had to map the charities, the shelters. Then we carried out interviews and surveys with our surveyors in conditions that are far from the usual conditions. And then we didn't want to do just counting. Now, some cities, such as Paris, go out and count people who are sleeping outside. But we wanted to go beyond. We wanted not only to count these people, but also to hear their stories. Now, you had a second question, which is relative to the relative poverty rate or absolute poverty rate. Now, if you look at the French overseas territories, such as Guyane, for instance, which is in Latin America, and then the poorest French overseas territory is Mayotte, which is an island close to Madagascar off the coast of Africa. Now, if you look at income poverty, if you compare to the median income of the territory, or if you compare to the median income of the total area of France, then the threshold, of course, is completely different. If you compare mainland France median income with Guyane or Mayotte, of course, the gap is extremely wide. And we have documented the fact that depending on the public policy that you were looking out for, both measures, so both absolute poverty and relative poverty, had their importance. And I also had a third question that I made up and that I will answer. What is our margin for improvement in this type of exercise? In France, and I have already discussed this with ATD Fourth World, I think we need to improve our statistics regarding what you have dubbed institutional maltreatment, what I would call the prejudice caused by institutional complexity. Poor people are faced much more frequently to institutional complexity because they have to go to several services, they can be eligible for several benefits, and so they are more exposed and therefore they suffer more from this type of aspect. And I think we could do more in our surveys with more questions on this. And then there's also social maltreatment, but maybe this is purely a French issue. Often, poverty in France is equivalent to dissolution of social ties and foregoing of social relations. And this is something that we have very little information on and that we should enrich our surveys in order to better map what is happening. Now, these surveys, they are made accessible to all researchers. So what we have at INSEE is open.
There are different indicators that can be used already and then provide different picture. In this respect, going back to the World Bank and to Dean, if you use other definition of poverty and you compare them with the traditional one that the bank has elaborated in the past, do you see gap? Do you see differences? And in particular, if you see differences, I would like you to give us an example of a case in which there is a big difference and another in which the difference is limited.
Sure, thanks. Thanks very much. So in our recent report where we announced sort of our estimate of the total number of people living in extreme poverty, we've also spent time talking about sort of supplemental measures or supplemental ways of thinking about what it means to be poor in the world. And so we are now offering, we'll now be reporting on measures that we're calling a societal poverty line, which is something like a global relative poverty line. We're also reporting now on something that we're calling a multidimensional poverty measure, which is sort of influenced by lots of the outstanding work that's been done by other groups on the multidimensional poverty index. And so maybe I'll talk just a moment about the multidimensional poverty measure. So what we do that's a little bit different in our measure is that since our core focus has been on extreme poverty, what we've decided to do is to construct a multidimensional measure that's anchored in that measure of extreme poverty. And so we offer a couple of alternative ways of thinking about multidimensional poverty measure, but the one for which we have the most data, we reported on about 119 countries, is one where it's based on 3 dimensions. One is this monetary dimension, which is primarily the consumption or income dimension of well-being. Another dimension then is essentially on education attainment of the household. And in particular, that's very clearly sort of a non-monetary measure. It's one that doesn't get picked up well in measures of consumption or income. And then a third dimension is access to basic services, so things like water and electricity and sanitation. And I think, well, almost by definition, we've stated that if someone is in extreme poverty based on deprivation in terms of materials, they're also defined by our construct as being deprived in this multidimensional sense. So as soon as we add on these additional dimensions, then clearly the prevalence or the number of people who are poor by this broader definition is much larger. That's not a surprising result. That's almost by definition. What's probably the most useful aspect of this measure, since we're anchoring it in extreme poverty, is to understand in what ways do people who suffer from extreme deprivation in terms of consumption also suffer from a lack of education and a lack of access to infrastructure. Are these exactly the same people, or are they different people? And the answer to that question then has sort of important implications for thinking about the types of policy that you design and how you go about measuring this. If it's the case that the people who suffer from extreme poverty as based on consumption are the same as the people who are suffering in deprivation in terms of education and access to services, then how you go about measuring this matters a little bit less, because if you correctly measure consumption but do a not so good job on some of the other dimensions, you'll still identify the right people in terms of who are poor. But the problem of defining the right policy then is quite complex, because you have to worry about not only are they poor in this dimension, but they're poor in many dimensions, and so the policy has to account for that. Perhaps the counter to that is if they don't overlap, then even just identifying who is poor matters, because you have to identify who's poor in terms of consumption deprivation, who's poor in terms of education deprivation, and who's poor in terms of the access to deprivation. And so it's the extent of those overlaps that is pretty powerful. And so one quick finding that we have is when we look at we aggregate this up at the regional level, and it seems that in sub-Saharan Africa, the extent of the overlaps are the greatest. So essentially, if you're suffering from poverty by this multidimensional measure of being deprived in any of these 3 dimensions, then half of those people are deprived in multiple dimensions. So there's a great amount of overlap in sub-Saharan Africa. When you look at South Asia, the overlap is significantly lower. So if you're poor by a multidimensional sense in South Asia, only 25% of those people are poor in multiple dimensions. And so thinking about identifying who is poor in South Asia is going to be a much more challenging sort of issue. Thinking about sort of dealing with the intensity of poverty is going to be a much more challenging issue in sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you. Corinne, somehow the same question. What explains the greater traction of the indicator you are elaborating in developing than in rich country, if I got it right?
So I think the method itself can certainly be applied in any context, regardless of the wealth GDP of the country. I think historically there has been more traction in developing countries, but that's due to a few sort of unrelated aspects. One is the data availability, that there was DHS and mixed data about material deprivation for these countries available already. Another is this discourse that we were talking about in the earlier session, that historically much of the work on poverty has been focused in countries in the global south. And so that's where people are used to thinking about tackling poverty. And then the third is, particularly in Latin America, where much of this work started really taking off, there had already been a historical discourse within Latin America thinking about poverty as being multidimensional, going back to the basic needs approach and beyond. So I think there's been more movement just in the last few years about using these types of measures in wealthier countries, and that's likely to continue into the future.
Thank you, Corinne. Marco, so if we have to make operational, therefore, we have seen that they have been adopted in different ways, or there is convergence in the operation of statistics with the result of the research in certain aspects. If we want to make even more operational those things, what should we do? And I am raising the question because I have the impression sometimes that paradoxically, when it comes to poverty in OECD, and obviously not the statistical directorates, but other parts of the house, tend to continue to use income in reality very often as measure of poverty. So how can we make those advances in the discussion and the contribution that have been made more operational?
But my short answer would be, I think we should get used to think about poverty through a dashboard rather than a single number. And so giving up with the pretension that a single number will be able to give a full portrait about the extent and the reality of the life of the poor.
So this is also that Jean-Luc was recalling of the media, that they wanted the...
I think a dashboard will have more than one user. The media, of course, is one important one, but there will be a range of people that will be interested in using those numbers. And so we should have a dashboard that also addresses different type of demand that are coming from different group of people, from civil society. There are point of entries that people could use to keep governments accountable for their commitment, leaving no one behind. I mean, it is something to sign a declaration in the General Assembly in front of your peers. It's something else when you go back and then say, are you doing anything in order to honor those commitments? So what, in my view, should belong to this, to this dashboard? I said earlier, the important having measure about poor people direct experiences, psychological experience. That's something that surely belongs. Having measured about people's society's views about the nature of poverty. That's another thing that have a claim to belong. But then I would say, I think it would be important we need to have a measure about that is focus on economic resources. Now there can be latitude in terms, should it be income only? Should we go beyond? Should we look at trying to integrate consumption and in some of the measures that in France have been discussed at some point about the idea of reste à payer. I mean, what is left after you have paid? You may have an income, but after you have paid your rent, your utilities, and something else. I mean, what is left? It may be something very, very different. Or you can go in the direction of trying to take account wealth, as the Secretary General mentioned early on this morning. Then I would argue we need a multidimensional measure. But I think there is an important distinction that I would make between the type of material deprivation measure that are used in Europe and the more genuinely multidimensional measure that, for example, have been used by the colleagues in OFE. When you look at the material deprivation measure that are used in Europe, they are basically about people's lack in the fact that they cannot afford a range of durable items, or that they have payment arrears, or they cannot go afford a week away from home for holidays. They remain very much focused on what people get in their pocket and they can spend. I think the real importance of multidimensional measures when they go beyond the material is that they have a claim to bring to the table people from other ministers. If you say poverty is not just an issue about material resources, but is an issue about how our kids perform in school, well, you are engaging an educational minister in a way that it would not be if you stick to your definition of poverty just limited to material resources. The third point, I think, I would also make a case for the importance of looking at measures of subjective measure of poverty, of the type that the DRESS does in France, of the type that to some extent also at the OECD we have been trying to develop through a tool that is a web tool, a crowdsourced tool, which is called Compare Your Income, which asks people, tell us what is the income that you have, and tell us what you think that a family like yours would need to avoid poverty. And in many cases, there are significant differences. You may have people that we would count as poor based on our conventional threshold, but still they report themselves we could have people that we would not count as poor on our conventional threshold, but instead on a subjective basis they do so. And the interest of this subjective measure is that they are individual based, so they can tell us something potentially important about what happens within each family.
I have an additional question that appear on the screen. Very rich, your question. Unfortunately, I cannot fish too much from them because of reason of time, but they all are very interesting. But we have the advantage of having Jean-Luc here, and so one that was practically addressed to him was why the data we are discussing about take 2 years to be published. Why they are not, please.
Alors, c'est une question à laquelle je suis un peu habitué.
Now, this is the type of question that I'm used to, that I get very frequently. Now, there are two ways of calculating an income distribution, either through surveys or through administrative statistics, tax statistics, or social services statistics. So with tax databases or social database. And I'll just forget about the third way, big data and web scraping on the internet, which can also be used which cannot, be used to measure a poverty intensity or a poverty. It has been tried. It will never work out, I think. Now, in France, we have been aware for a long time that surveys are not enough, but what is reliable is using surveys and databases, tax databases and social benefits databases. And these databases take time to be constructed. That's why we can only publish poverty rate and poverty intensity 2 years after the fact. But we do carry out detailed surveys on persistence of living in poverty. And I think this is also a crucial aspect. And we do have surveys and studies on that. We're not trying to hide anything. And since we know that this lateness is an issue, we have micro simulation studies in order to have estimates 1 year ahead of time without having to wait 2 full years. Now, we have specific techniques, micro simulation techniques, which I won't go into depth here.
I'm very sorry with the panelists of this panel because we have discussions so rich that obviously the time was reduced also because we need coffee and other work around the coffee. As such, we could only address those things. Nevertheless, I'm very happy for what I am listening because it seems that the engagement of different actors to go in the direction that we are discussing this morning is there. Now you can see different rhythm, different possibility, but everybody is working with the same objective. That to go back to my brothers from Latin America recalls to me a song of Zita Rosa from Uruguay that used to say, "En mi país que tristeza, la pobreza y el rancor. Ma dice mi padre que llegará desde el fondo del tiempo, otro tiempo." Translated in English sounds more or less. In my country, what a sadness, the poverty and the hunger. But my father says that from the end of time will come other time. And with this, I give the floor to Robert to make his comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. Thank you, members of the... Thank you, members of the panel, for being here, for engaging with the research, to acknowledging and recognizing the multidimensionality of poverty, and all of you being clearly committed to addressing it and doing something about it. And particularly, I think, responding in recognizing that multidimensionality means a multiplicity of policies, not one department, but many working together. I would like to make 3 points arising from your discussion. The first is the observation that different definitions and different measures yield different answers as to the numbers of people we count as poor and to who they are. And that raises the question of the validity of our measures. And I would submit to you that our work, by talking directly to people with experience of poverty, has a face validity that demands us to take account of the dimensions that we have come up with. Secondly, I would suggest that we find that poverty is fundamentally experienced through emotions, the psychosocial dimensions that Ruth referred to in her talk. And I think the evidence is that emotions are more stable across cultures and countries because we are all human than our measures based on consumption. And therefore, that opens up the possibility of using these psychosocial measures to get stable estimates of poverty across countries and therefore to stimulate this global debate. I think they also put people back in the heart of poverty, people rather than possessions or lack of possessions. And it is just possible that that might enable us to engage better with the media and with public opinion who imposes constraints upon what we do. It is deeply disappointing that we tried hard to get journalists to come and to cover this event today. I don't know if anybody did arrive, but the basic message was, we're not that interested. Maybe if we talk about people rather than numbers, maybe we will actually get their ear and therefore enable us to shape the debate. And finally, we do have to measure. It is clear we have to measure progress, to measure effectiveness. We recognize that measures are going to be partial. But it seems to me that as we think about these concepts and think about instruments, as we have shaped our concepts through participation with people experiencing poverty and those working alongside them, surely we can engage people in developing our instruments in the same way. Not as people we just consult, But people who shape the questions, shape the issues, are with us from beginning to end. So I sort of rest my case, but thank you all for participating and engaging. This is a profoundly important issue. Obviously, that's why we're here. I think we can do something about it together.
Thank you very much for this very interesting panel and your your remarks, Robert, to not forget to actually engage with the people who live in poverty. Even I think your last point on, asking them to actually help design the questions is very, very important. That's something that Marco said, because it's, you wouldn't know how, there are great difficulties actually in shaping up the surveys in a way that would talk to the people and where they would actually feel that they can answer properly to the question. So I think that's a very interesting point. But after having discussed the measurement, we're now going to talk about how this research is actually challenging perhaps the way we address poverty and hence the policies and actions to combat poverty. And so, again, what's the way forward? And for this, I give the floor to Monica Kreiser.
Thank you very much, Martine. I'm delighted to be here today and listen to these many very interesting statements and contributions to the debate. I'm head of social policy at the OECD, and I think that this debate now comes to at a perfect moment, because we're seeing a bit of a sea change in the social policy debate in OECD countries at the moment, where we're moving away from only relying on measurement and data to something much more qualitative. Why is that so? Well, simply because there's a political reaction to what is going on. So look at the movements in Europe on populist voting, and people are sitting there saying, but the data don't show that these people are poor. Why do they feel excluded? And often there's sentiments and emotions that drive voting behavior in a much stronger extent than it used to be the case. So suddenly we see policymakers waiting up saying, well, maybe this is all wrong. Maybe we're focusing our policies on the wrong questions, and we need to know much more about what people are actually thinking. And then, as Martine just mentioned, and as we heard also in the previous debate, the real problem comes when we try to translate this into policy. So you can collect a lot of things, a lot of information, but how do you synthesize this and then make it into something that is really useful and changes the policies on the ground? And at the OECD, we had a social policy ministerial meeting last year in Montreal, where social policy ministers from all OECD countries and a number of non-member countries came together to discuss these issues. And indeed, they said to us, we would like you to work with us on better stakeholder engagement. So in the social policy division, we're now working to collect good practices from member countries on how to talk to stakeholders. And this is not only about poverty, this is also about users of healthcare services, which can be poor or rich, it doesn't matter. This is about unemployment benefits, about all kinds of social policies for all kinds of people in all countries. And I have to say, it's quite challenging, because on one thing is that the governments tell us, please look for good examples, and then you need to get them to submit their good examples. And we're chasing and chasing, but if you watch this space, you will see that we will provide some good practices that countries have been telling us. Now, what we've also done was to say, the world is changing so rapidly at the moment with globalization, digitalization, automation, migration, so all those Asians that are happening at the same time. We launched a survey in 21 OECD countries to ask people what keeps them up at night. What are they worrying about? And here is the report on this. You can find it on our website, Risks That Matter. And I have to say, the results of this were quite surprising. What's less surprising was when we said, what are your short-term worries? Most people were worried about becoming ill or disabled. With the long-term worry, not surprising again, per definition almost, is that people were more worried about pensions in the future. But we also asked them, do you feel that if you needed support from your government tomorrow, would you think you would get it? And the overwhelming majority of people in OECD countries said they didn't think they would. Now that to me is a shocking result, because remember, you have countries like France in there, which is the biggest spender on social protection of all of the OECD countries. And even in a country like Norway or the Netherlands, those were the kind of best countries, there were still 30% of people who said, we don't think we'd get benefits if we really needed them. The other question we said, do you think people are listening, the governments are listening to people like me? And guess what? Surprise, surprise. Of course, people said, no, we do not believe that governments are listening to us. But what was also interesting is that it was the older people, more than the younger people, who were very pessimistic about having voice in that debate. We thought that younger people were more disenchanted, but in fact, it's older people who more often say, we're not being heard. And this comes in a situation where, at least in OECD countries, older people have benefited probably more from social policy in last years, where their poverty risk has gone down a lot, whereas it's been increasing for younger people. So there's a lot of, I would really like to encourage you to look at this study in more detail, because there's many puzzles, and it's not going to make it easier for policymakers, but I think it does ask some of the really important questions. You'll find a lot of breakdown into different risks, what people are worrying about, and we want to do the same thing in 2020, and we encourage a lot of input telling us what other questions we should be asking in the future in this study. So that, by matter of introduction, we are now going to turn to the really thorny issue of how are we going to get to the right policies with all this new and interesting and on-the-ground data that people are collecting. And for that, we have a wonderful panel here today. Let me introduce them briefly. Next to me is Tanga Navel Palanivel, Deputy Director of the Human Development Report Office, the United Nations Development Program from New York. Welcome. Then we have François Bourguignon, Chair Emeritus of the Paris School of Economics, but of course also very well known in his previous function as former Chief Economist of the World Bank. Then we have Alison Tate. Alison is the Director for Economic and Social Policy at the International Trade Union Confederation. And last but not least, Jean-Paul Moati, member of the Global Sustainable Development Report Expert Group. Welcome to all of the panelists, and many thanks for being here today. We'll start our discussion with a point that was just mentioned in the previous panel, and that is about the definition of poverty, money, and material deprivation. Now, François, you have had a long experience with this, and when we speak about poverty, we tend to, as we said before, lose some aspects that are important. Money and material deprivation alone are not enough. Why is this a problem? Could you explain a little bit more in detail your view?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that the problem when it comes to this question you've asked comes from one single word, the word alone. Policies which try to reduce poverty only through monetary instruments or material instruments are necessary, of course, that goes without saying, but they're not sufficient. I think that's the real issue. So saying that we want to reduce poverty or suffering caused by poverty only with those policies is indeed, I think, wrong. But I think it's also important to differentiate between different things which are not always done, which is not always done when you come to this debate on poverty. First of all, when you talk about the fight against poverty and material poverty, I think one has to differentiate between policies. There are policies which look at the income generation, the creation of income, and the policies which redistribute. It's not the same. It's clearly spelled out in the study that we've just looked at. The first dimension which was highlighted in the presentation, is work, having a job and having income from one work. So the first policy is that, to guarantee to individuals in a society that they have a possibility of producing the income that they need in order to have a decent life. Second kind of policy, since we cannot succeed for different reasons, I won't go into the details of that, we need policies which allow us to build safety nets so that if a person doesn't have the necessary wherewithal, there will be a possibility of filling that gap with these social policies, as we've said. They're very important in France and indeed in most of the OECD countries. And differentiating between these policies and highlighting the fact that the second batch of policies is a kind of safety net, a spare wheel. We don't necessarily want to use the spare wheel. We prefer to avoid using the spare wheel. In terms of importance, it's the first batch of policies which is important, allowing each individual to produce their own income. And the reason why, even if these two approaches are not sufficient, is because of what we've heard. The non-material issues in poverty, what people who are living in poverty actually feel, and the consequences of remaining for a certain amount of time in conditions of poverty, those are policies which are not highlighted, which don't necessarily exist, or if they do, they're very, very vague and blurred in most advanced economies. And I think there, the study does show well that there is a real shortfall there. But to take this a little bit further, in order to illustrate the importance of that hidden dimension of poverty, two last comments I'd like to make. The first is that there's a little bit of a paradox here in the fact that part of this suffering of these hidden dimensions of poverty is caused by the redistribution policies. A lot of it is due to the fact that because you're poor, because you haven't been able to create the income you need to live, you have to resort to going to the social services. You have to have this difficult relationship, difficult for oneself, difficult given the relationship one will have with the person facing you, and which aggravates the situation, worsens the suffering caused by poverty, because that's really fundamental when you think about policies. We are creating through this redistribution policy this situation because it's not always well designed, and we're actually worsening poverty in some ways through this. Last thing, this policy which could concern the hidden parts of poverty are also the same policies which will increase individuals' ability to produce the income or have an economic activity which will allow them to produce an income to live on. The suffering that we're talking about, isolation, social isolation, which people living in poverty put themselves in, not on their own accord, reduces their ability over time to produce the economic resources to allow them to live. So we cannot say that all these dimensions are independent. They're all very closely linked. And I think that what we need to take away from this study, which I think is a great study, a very interesting one, and personally, I've learnt an awful lot reading through it. And thanks to the contact that I've had with ATD Carmonde, thanks to the study, what we've learnt is that that hidden dimension is hugely important, but it can fit into a more conventional, traditional approach of policies to fight poverty.
On a point that François was just making about the shame or the problems of reinforcing poverty when you have to go to a benefit office and ask for a benefit. That was a point that really struck me in this report about institutional maltreatment, that people who speak about the way they're being treated by institutions. And that's something that is extremely concrete in a sense, because it gives us pointers to how to improve the way institutions interact and the way people who are in a position where they have to help get support from these institutions come. So Palani, you have some views on this, how we can improve this hidden poverty dimension.
Thank you, Monica. At the outset, I also wanted to thank the organizers for inviting me and representing UNDP in this important meeting. I really enjoyed the morning discussions, the way actually, in fact, the process, getting inputs from the different actually people. It's really, and the report is very interesting. So now going to the actually, I mean, the chair asked me to how we could use institutions to address some of the relational aspects of poverty. To the addressing poverty from the relational perspective, is we need to focus we need to focus on the institutions, how the institutions mediate in human relationship, because human relationship is the core of the human life. So how actually the institutions which mediate between, the social relationship between rich and poor, between men and women, between land business owners and the laborers, and also between citizens and the political representative. So that is actually the kind of first focus. Then it's also involved how these institutions play. These institutions play an important role in ensuring labor rights and also the access to the credit, access to the justice, access to the all kind of other ensuring the social fairness, equity, ensuring the equity and opportunities and other things. So in this respect, given I was asked to speak not more than 3 or 4 minutes, I'm just going to pick up 3 institutions, like how labor market institutions, how that financial banking institutions, how also the governance judicial institutions. Very, very briefly, let's start with labor market institutions. Historically, experts have been arguing that the labor market institutions play an important role in ensuring collective bargaining, like minimum wages and the type of employment contract and the working time regulations, and also the labor institutions also play important role in pensions, social safety net, all kind of other things. But what happened that it was actually until early 90s, most of these labor market institutions, most of those countries, in fact, tend to be more pro-poor, tend to be more labor-oriented. But somewhere in the 90s, the narrative changed. Probably some of the institutions, like even OECD, came out with a report in 1994 or something like that, the job strategy, which actually advocated for more deregulations, flexible labor market, as the key for, improving, boosting investment, accelerating economic growth, improving international competitiveness, all those things. It was actually, somewhat good strategy in the context of globalization. But in the recently, there are a number of studies shows that such actually flexible labor market and weakened the trade unionization, now also collective bargaining weakened. As a result, income inequalities actually increase in many countries recently. And so therefore, we need to find some fine balance between, a kind of labor market institutions which need to be also taken to the concern of the workers, because recently the middle class seems to be suffering because there is affirmative action to support the poor. And there are studies from the World Bank highlighted that there is in number of many countries, the per capita income of the bottom 40% of the people increasing at a faster rate than the average per capita income of the country. So therefore, the rich people benefit due to the reduction in the tax rates and other things. Poor people also tend to benefit. So it's in the middle, the workers class suffering. So we need to strengthen the labor market institutions. So that's my first point. The second point is that financial institution, even in the name of liberalizing financial markets, banks, and many countries actually weakened some of the banking financial institutions, which tend to give some kind of concessional credit to the poor marginal groups, more like the microcredit, microinsurance, those kind of things. Again, in the name of financial liberalization, and that actually weakened in the recent years. But again, thanks to some of the new advocacy, many countries now try to promote that kind of inclusive financial actually institutions. Because in our view, the UNDP, EU, and even OECD, we try to advocate even the Secretary General this morning actually highlighted the importance of inclusive financial actual institutions to support, to mobilize the savings of the poor, and also give them credit to the poor, and so all kind of other things. And now the technology allow us to play a role, because there is, mobile, smartphone. With that, you can actually try to actually use the, facilitate, collect savings and give them credit. The third one, again, actually on the legal governance institutions. Even in legal governance institutions, most of the actually, some of those institutions by nature tend to actually favor or support the elite groups, people in urban city areas. Often they don't actually focus, people living in rural, in remote areas. But on top of it, actually, some of the policy or regulation or restrictions in many countries, even developing countries, there is a restrictions being homeliness, restriction for begging, restrictions, in living in street, or all kind of other things. And that actually also directly, indirectly actually, affect the people who's living in poor countries, in cities and in urban areas. So again, we need to actually, ensure that how we could actually improve access to justice, also ensure that some of those legal governance institutions can be made more actually taking into the consideration of the poor people living in city areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alison, I saw you nodding when Palani was mentioning the labor market institutions, but I'm not going to let you get away so easily. We're seeing a lot of rejections and numbers of trade union membership going down, people saying that I do not want to, nobody hears me anymore. And we see this here in France very strongly, for example, that the labor market institutions are no longer being used to actually voice concern. And how are you reacting to this? And specifically, how are you succeeding in bringing in the voice of those who have no voice in the trade union movement?
Thank you for the great question, and good morning, everybody. I first want to acknowledge the great diversity of voices here this morning and how important that is. It brings such a richness not just to the conversation, but actually that is a part of ensuring economic and social justice. So firstly, trade unions are very favorable to multi-dimensional poverty analysis, acknowledging this. Indeed, the inclusion of poor people, whether we identify as being working poor, or multiple jobs working poor, or informal economy workers, or organized workers in trade unions, or so-called unorganized workers outside trade unions, we are workers. So the point of the relevance of trade unions and the labor market institutions is not one that is changing because of changing technology or changing concepts, or trade unions don't represent me. When we ask members who are not trade unions why you are not a member of a trade union, often it is either I'm fearful to join, I don't have the money to join, or no one asked me to join, right? But the point I really want to get to is that poverty is so beautifully expressed today, strongly linked to inequality. Inequality of opportunity, inequality of income, and many other denial of opportunities. So when we talk about access to decent work, as this report does, access to adequate incomes, to work that is underpinned by human rights, it is not that trade unions have given up the fight on that, or that indeed even trade unions are not being listened to. I can see a whole room of people listening to me now. And our membership at the global level is 210 million workers. It's not the point about voices not being raised, but actually policy makers not taking those voices into consideration and taking action on that. So I want to just address, when we talk about workers' rights and human rights, we are talking about gender rights, indigenous people's rights, migrant workers' rights. We are talking about the right to social protection that our colleague just beautifully summarized. When we are talking about social security, social protection, it somehow seems the meaning has been lost, that this means security. For job security, between jobs, maybe having unemployment benefits, or after work in elderly care days, where people still contribute to society, but that we have social protection to underpin the cost of living that is adequate enough to meet the cost of living. This is where we see arguments from many institutions and governments that, it's not about social security anymore. It's not about social protection. That's because we can't afford this social protection anymore. What? We as a society cannot afford. The fact is, the IMF and others have shown that the feasibility of affordability of social protection is possible for all countries. It's actually a political decision and a decision that has been made to allocate resources elsewhere. So the point of voice, because I know we have a short time, but the point of voice is not only that voices be heard, that people engage and participate, and as the report talks about in your work, friends, is being involved in the design of the policies, it's actually that policymakers and institutions listen and take into account. And that is a power relationship. So the point of voice is not just the visibility of poor people or trade union members or informal economy workers. It's actually addressing the systemic issues to address poverty. And that means that people demand change. Institutions don't demand change. They respond to the demands of people. So the point of voice is actually not only collective voice beyond the individual, however that may be. Community groups, trade unions, syndicate, cooperatives, however we define our own group, that must be underpinned by rights to freedom of association, and that's then about people organizing and having the rights to organize to be respected. So I'll just finally say, because there's so much more I could share, but the point about whether trade unions are the people to be claiming our rights in the workplace, that's obvious, or in industry, or even at the level where I work at international institutions level, it's actually about having the right to be organized, the right to join a trade union or an organization to represent us more than our individual into the collective, and that decision makers pay attention to those voices, not only to the statistics or to the economic arguments, but actually engage with and participate with those representing poor trade union members, informal economy workers, etc. So I'd just like to say, though, that we see that trade union rights, fundamental human rights, are under attack in every country, no matter the level of development and no matter of the level of democracy or participatory democracy. We see that workers are being dismissed from work or don't have the rights to more than a 0-hour contract. And that was just described by our colleague here, is what the report refers to when workers are dismissed without warning or payment. These are the things we need to fight back against, and that's why social dialogue and social partnership is so important. Thank you.
Jean-Paul, you are one. 15 experts mandated by the UN Secretary General to draft the first report assessing the progress in reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. And obviously, many things that we've been talking about here this morning and will continue to talk about all day are enshrined in the framework of the SDGs. Now, for us, a very interesting question is this type of research that was presented here and that has this qualitative aspect, how do you use this in your assessment, and what is the role of such work for your report?
Thanks, Monica, and merci à toutes celles et tous ceux qui...
And thank you very much to everybody who has participated in this work, because it is extremely timely, really. It is bringing us an original and a new vision with regard to two key messages that we want to transmit in the report that is going to be presented in September at the United Nations General Assembly. For the first time in the history of the United Nations, this is a non-negotiable report. Of course, it's a dialogue with everyone, with all of the member states, but we have the right in that report to say what we want on the basis, obviously, of scientific observations, including the results of this study. So there are two significant messages that this study is helping us to reinforce. The first is that we must stop limiting ourselves, even if it's important, to concepts that are only based on a monetary threshold, $9 per person per day, to talk about poverty. We must now move to a multidimensional conception of poverty. And this is for several reasons. If we don't do that, we could congratulate ourselves, as some do, that since 2000 we've reduced the number of people living on less than $1.9 a day by 2 million people. Or 200 million people. But in fact, we've had an extra billion people who are living at only a little bit more than that a day. And so they're fully vulnerable to all of the conflicts and the social, environmental and economic shocks that we may suffer. If we want really to fight against poverty, we need to take into account its multidimensionality, all of these elements that you have quite rightly mentioned so far. And the second message, very important message that you're helping us to transmit with the results of this study, is that the fight against poverty and the reduction of inequalities are things that are inextricably linked. Let's be clear, in the Millennium Development Goals, which preceded the SDGs, there was this implicit idea that, yes, we needed to eliminate extreme monetary poverty, but if the price to be paid for that was that everybody progressed, and too bad if the people who were already the richest got even richer, that idea that the fight against poverty could accept as a price, as a cost, the increase of inequalities within countries on the basis that the richest would get even richer as a result. Now, this is something that we need to completely abandon. And these things are inextricably linked. In the world today, we are seeing a concentration of wealth which is entirely incompatible with the Sustainable Development Goals. The fact that 1% of the world's population today controls 40% of the total wealth of the world, where in the 1980s it was only 20% of the wealth of the world that they controlled. 75%, the great majority of people in the world, have stagnated, holding some 10% of the world's total wealth. This is fully incompatible with the Sustainable Development Goals. So we need to inextricably link reduction of inequality with poverty reduction goals. And there are some very simple things to do in this regard, and your study will help us to do this. In the Sustainable Development Goals to date, particularly SDG 10 relating to inequalities, we have a fairly vague statement, which is that the poorest 40% of a country's population need to see their income grow faster than the average. And we don't say whether faster means 10% increase or 0.00001%. higher. So the first thing we need to do is ask the countries which need to make contributions every year to give us more precise quantitative goals. Those goals might be different from one country to another, but they must specify for it to be clear and transparent. Our Mexican colleague who is working on this, to combat poverty in Mexico for many years now, involves going beyond this monetary target, which is very important, to say that in addition, each country, each territory needs to define, with regard to people suffering conditions of poverty, what are the targets to be aimed at for in decreasing poverty. And then those countries need to give regular reports on the progress with regard to those indicators of the reduction of poverty.
A little bit more on what you just talked about, the poverty issue and the measurement of poverty and the extreme poverty and the relative versus absolute. Of course, it makes a big difference, perhaps, but maybe in the end not so much, particularly if you look at particular groups, like for the trade unions. Alison, how does it change for you working with countries in the north, or in countries in the north and countries in the south? Where do you put your priorities? Because, I mean, as Jean-Paul just very convincingly laid out, we have so many different policy challenges, which ideally we would all be addressing at the same time, hence the whole framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. But how do you set your priorities? Because everybody can, we need to break it down into something that's manageable, which, by the way, for us at the OECD is always a huge challenge. We've been working on inequality for more than 30 years. And every time we do these elaborate presentations of all the data and everything that's happening, and then we come to the policy bit, and then we say, okay, so what should countries be doing? And then we have huge lists of things which countries should be doing, and ideally everything at the same time. But let's be practical, we have to prioritize. So how do you think we should be prioritizing in those different regions?
So all policies at the same time sounds very complicated, doesn't it? But it's not. If we are not coherent, we are not going to impact any of those interconnecting issues. And that's the whole results of your work, I think, and this report. We have to learn to join the dots. I don't know in English, but we say we can actually walk and chew gum at the same time, right? We can do two things at the same time. We must be able to say, no matter the level of economic development or the development pathways, we know that there are some fundamental universal points of policy. And if we are going to ensure that the labor market institutions, which often in poorer countries is not functioning so well or is not sufficiently resourced, still the labor market institutions are a foundation for what we need to do to ensure coherence of policy and to strengthen those. And that's in the richest countries in the world and the poorest countries in the world. The labor market institutions play a very significant role. And when I say that, I mean minimum living wages, wage setting mechanisms to ensure all workers, no matter the industry they work in or the farm or the plantation or the workplace. It's also about having the social protection systems. Very often they can be quite underdeveloped, or they're limited in their scope, or the coverage of enough people is not sufficient, or the amount of social protection paid is not sufficient, or that the wages, minimum living wages, are not adequate to cover costs of living or for people to live in dignity. Now, I'm sorry, friends, but that's all over the world. It doesn't matter if it's a poor country or a rich country, in economic terms, let alone in cultural terms or in community building terms or democratic terms. So if we're looking at the fact that poor people are excluded from broader society for having a voice in those institutions or excluded from the labor market itself, then we are looking at the coverage by labor law, the formalization of employment. That means the coverage of rights in law, but in practice too, so that minimum living wages are real, access to social protection, fundamental human rights, I mentioned already. But we need public policies that actually have an objective to prevent poverty. So if we have moved the distance away from that, then this is our problem. And so the coherence, I think, on wages policy, on social protection policy, on acknowledging the nature of work in different economies. It will be different in different communities and different countries. For sure it is. But we need to tackle precarious forms of work that undermine security of employment. Or we have a body of universal labor standards. It's 100 years since the International Labour Organization was established, and core labor standards apply to every country in the world. It's not okay someone says, we'll step away from that, it doesn't apply to our country. It does. And so, to ensure, though, that those universal labor standards, like overcoming forced labor and child labor and discrimination in employment and freedom of association and collective bargaining, they are the 4 core labor standards to be applied in every country. But what we see is that they're not universally applied or they're not universally enforced. And so that is the reason why I say, actually, the foundations of supporting and strengthening labour market institutions is one of the things that all the institutions should be addressing. And as was said, in the 1980s and 1990s and since, we have seen the undermining of that. And as a result, huge inequalities in the labour market in all countries. And if we want to say this is about, the beyond GDP, if we say at a national level that GDP doesn't adequately reflect well-being at a national level, which I would agree, it's beyond GDP as a measure of addressing inequality and poverty. The same thing, that economic growth is less and less shared with workers through their salaries or through wages. And those inequalities need to be addressed in a fundamental way by the institutions.
Thanks, Alison. François, more or less the same question to you. The North-South differences, and is it really, listening to Alison, it seems that there's very little differences, almost only in small degrees, but is that your experience as well?
No,
I actually think that the difference is much greater than that. It seems to me that the major difference is a question of volume. Developing economies are poor economies in which a very large part of the population is living below a poverty threshold, regardless of how you measure that threshold, whether it's in monetary terms, in multidimensional terms, in terms of privations, and so on. Poverty is a major phenomenon in those countries. In those countries, you can't envisage reducing poverty without accelerating those countries' growth. So the volume of available resources in the countries needs to increase in order for poverty to decline. And that volume of resources needs to grow. But of course, as Alison says, the volume must grow in an inclusive manner. So it needs to concern the whole of the population and not benefit only an elite which will enrich itself eventually to the detriment of the rest of the population. So this growth, which is inclusive growth, is a field in which the OECD has done an enormous amount of work. And that inclusive growth, I believe, is an absolutely necessary precondition for the reduction of poverty in those parts of the world. It involves particularly investing in human capital. Earlier, when I was talking about the capacity to generate income, the capacity to generate income involves having the necessary training to be able to find work, perhaps in a modern part of the economy that generates significant revenue in order to have a decent living wage. Now, that is of fundamental importance, and that's why focusing on education policy is so important, focusing on the fact that it's not simply sending children to school, but being sure that those children are going to learn something from school and emerge from the school system with skills. Those things are fundamentally important. And these are not results that we'll observe overnight. These are results that we'll see 15 or 20 years from now, and if we don't make that effort, we know that poverty is rather going to increase, and these inequalities will grow greater as well. So this investment is vital. Are all of these policies as important in the developed countries? I would say yes. Of course, we would prefer that inequalities do not increase in these countries. We hope that the increases in purchasing power, which are of a lower quantity in developed countries, should be shared out across the whole population. But there are people who, for one reason or another, have slipped through the cracks and missed out on the process of regular progressive enrichment of the population as a whole. And we need to assist these people in order to help them to hopefully recover the capacity that they've lost. And so in the north, in the developed countries, the situations are not exactly the same as in the south countries. There are similarities. Cash transfers in developed countries to reduce financial poverty are things that we're starting to see in developing countries as well. Increasingly, things that cash transfers in the developing countries that didn't exist at all in 20 years ago. So an increased focus on redistribution of wealth. In a country like France, social aid, social benefits and social payments are given to people without a requirement of a prior contribution of to the working system or to the social security system by the person who receives them. But that only represents about 5% of government expenditure in France. So we're talking about different volumes of need. The policies of redistribution are very important, not just monetary redistribution of wealth, but also in terms of access to healthcare, access to education, retraining and reskilling for people who are unemployed. But it goes beyond that. It's also how those advantages, how those benefits are treated. The report, as we've heard, presents all of this. It's the way in which this redistribution is carried out that's very important. I'll conclude on one point that I did mean to say when I had the floor previously, and it is this. It may seem a utopic to say this, or utopian, to talk about the universal basic income or basic wage. But it seems to me obvious that if we were able to achieve that redistribution, at least in developed countries, it would be a good thing. The available studies show us that it is possible. More than 30 years ago, I demonstrated this as well. The French redistribution system, as it is now, is not that far away from such a system. The difference is that it has 1,000 completely different elements that have nothing to do with each other, which makes the system completely illegible, completely opaque, and very difficult to navigate for the people who actually have to go to the counters of these organizations to ask for given benefits and rights. But the basic approach would involve getting rid of that fragmentation, that difficulty. And that would be a massive step forward in the reduction of poverty, because not only would it guarantee a certain degree of security, because we would provide a basic living wage above the poverty threshold, not only would it eliminate the financial poverty, it would also eliminate a significant dimension of stigmatization that is associated with poverty. So I think that these are the kinds of policies we need to keep in mind and where we need to make progress.
It was great that you, because we have a question here. The question here is, when you talk about work, are you talking about an employment guarantee, and which role for unconditional basic income? So there you go. Excellent. We've already covered at least part of this. And thank you also for highlighting again the complexity of the French system, and thinking back to what I told you at the beginning, that in France, the majority of people are convinced that they would not get the assistance they need if they lose their income due to unemployment or illness or whatever. That shows you this discrepancy, that it's not enough to say, but we're spending so much, everything's okay. Something is not working here, because otherwise people wouldn't be convinced of that being the case. Can we just put the other questions back again? Because there's one for Jean-Paul now, which goes along there. Here. Considérer les personnes en situation de pauvreté.
Do you consider people living in poverty as true partners, and do you agree with merging their knowledge as well? Listening to people living in poverty is not enough.
That you're the CEO of is to have fair scientific partnership with developing countries. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and also again of the importance of the study that we're discussing here today in this context?
Yes, in Nature, which is one of the two most important scientific journals in the world, a few weeks ago there was an editorial published, and the title was in English.
Research, the best research, is when scientists co-elaborate the research with the communities involved. Mais malheureusement, dans la science en général, nous n'avons...
But generally, unfortunately, in science in general, we don't see enough examples of this type. Studies like the ATD Fourth World Study, participative science, or science in collaboration with the communities. In IRP, what we are doing at our own modest level is this, not because we're cleverer than anyone else, but simply because when we work with our partners in the South countries, for example, to introduce an agricultural method that uses fewer pesticides and represents less of a threat for the environment and for the planet, we have to work with people in the field. We have to work with farmers. We have to work particularly with women, who are too often underestimated. So circumstances oblige us perhaps to work more in terms of this science in collaboration with communities. We're forced to do it, if you like. And so one thing that really struck me with your study is that a certain number of the things that you say converge with our observations. Perhaps it's not expressed in the same way, but that converges with some of the most impressive advances made by international science. For example, the research on emotions, the work that you have done in your study on that basis, is something which the most experienced and best-known neurobiologists are doing themselves using their state-of-the-art tools. And another example, everything that you observed with regard to transmission between generations, transmission of poverty and inequality of opportunities between generations, is something which the most cutting-edge research today is observing, challenging the classical relationship between nature and nurture. Now, I don't have the time to explain all of this, but all of the epigenetic studies now are starting to show how certain acquired characteristics acquired through nurture, if you like, through the social environment as a result of poverty, can be transmitted from generation to generation and can be even integrated into the very bodies of people. So what you are expressing through your research, the voices that you are echoing, is paralleling some of the most cutting-edge results of science today. Now, as far as possible, you are acting to change the dynamic of the international scientific community, achieving a kind of sustainable science of sustainability. It's great if everybody works in their own specialist discipline, but here, when you're working on the experience of people in the field, working on their issues, you're mobilizing the expertise and the knowledge of all of the people, not just academics and scientists and experts and so on. You're working with the community, and that mobilizes the best possibility for action. Now, if 169 targets of if most of the targets of the OD or the SDGs become something of a beauty contest, we're not going to get anywhere. If every year people say we've ticked so many boxes if 163 out of 166 targets are making progress, and that is judged on the basis of box ticking, then we're not getting anywhere. It's really working with people, with the pressure of our populations, where that every country in each territory will find its own leverage, its own voice. And your report is working along those lines. It's not just when you cite Paris and New York and so on. It's when you talk about different points of entry to achieve this transformation so that everybody can establish their priorities working towards that aim, the best pathways for achieving it.
To wrap up the panel, because we have more, we have another comment afterwards, and also, as Martine said before, we don't want to have you line up before a closed canteen afterwards. We would like to have one good example, and a good example coming from the South, to how to achieve inclusive growth. And Palani would like to tell us a little bit about the example of Vietnam, which is something that other countries can learn from. So, Palani, the floor is yours for positive end.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yes, I consider among the country we studied, Vietnam is one of the countries experienced inclusive growth. In the last 25 years, probably many of you know that Vietnam managed to achieve almost 7% growth, and also significant reduction in poverty, and also modest reduction in inequality also. Let's just put that some numbers for you. When it comes to the extreme poverty, like the $1.9, Vietnam in the 25 years reduced from over 50% poverty incident to now less than 2%. So extreme poverty almost eliminated in Vietnam. And also the higher rate of poverty, whether it's a $3.2 per day per person, or the national poverty, that also declined dramatically. Now the latest figure is single digit, like 7-8%. If you also look into the inequality, as I indicated earlier, Vietnam is one of the countries, the per capita income of the poor are increasing at a faster rate than the per capita income of average Vietnamese citizen. So as a result, the Gini index, the coefficient measure income inequality also recorded a decline. So because of these things, also if you look into the human development, any type of developmental indicator, Vietnam making a significant progress. So therefore, I consider that Vietnam is one of the best performing country in promoting inclusive growth. Now let me tell you what are the reason. I want to highlight 4 reasons. One is the education policy, which has been highlighted the previous panel member also. The government put more money compared to other country in Asia, other country in the world. On average, about 6% of the GDP is putting on education there. And if you look into that, there the educational outcomes, like in terms of enrollment, in terms of other quality, Vietnam is recording again significant progress in terms of secondary education enrollment, which is increased dramatically. Similarly, enrollment in tertiary educations, also the pre-primary education, which is before going to primary education. And also Vietnam is sending a large number of students to abroad for technical and higher education. And so one thing helped is this skill required for Vietnam move into the more socialistic economy, into the more market-based economy. And so that's bringing to the second reason, which is Vietnam is one of the country managed to achieve a successful economic structural transformation. When I say that, they moved huge number of labor force from low productive agricultural sector into the manufacturing sector. As you know that Vietnam is one of the countries performing well in garments, textile exports. So every year, the garment textile, industries and constructions and retail tourism industries is providing job for 1 million new job. And certainly the wages in this manufacturing or the tourism construction is much, much higher than the agriculture. And so the second factor is that job creation and like particularly decent job creation and employment is growing over 2% per year in the last 10, 15 years. So that's the second reason. The third one is that under labor market policy, even though Vietnam moved from a communist country into the market economy, but they did not actually deregulate their labor market policy. Still, Vietnam, maintained a somewhat unique, very restrictive labor market policy. And they actually, if you look into some of their labor market actually regulation, it is really actually, how they go out of the way to ensure that the firing is becoming very problem. They have, in fact, a list of the category. The businesses won't be able to fire them. People like women, in a pregnant status, or women with young children, or people in sick, people in jail. They cannot actually, business cannot fire them, whatever the condition of the businesses. So they have social protection also. The government labor policies is very, very, tight to provide all kind of protection to the laborer. That's actually my third reason. The fourth one is also affirmative policies or more like rural development infrastructure policy. Because in the first 10, 15 years, Vietnam managed to reduce poverty at the national level. But then many actually people highlighted that the poverty incidence among ethnic minorities very high until recently. Again, government recognized that in the last 7, 8 years, they targeted actually ethnic minority in the last 6 to 7, 8 years. The reduction in poverty among ethnic minorities very, very high, very, very significant. So because the government recognized to tackling that kind of inclusive development, not just focusing only the majority population, but also focusing minority groups through affirmative action, through also promoting the areas in which the ethnic minority lives in mountain and other areas. So that's kind of policy. Many other countries could learn how a country which about 25 years back, in a generation back, where most of the population living in extreme poverty, how they managed to reduce poverty, also make rapid economic growth without actually widening income inequality, which is actually challenges many of the rapid growing countries in the world, whether it's China, whether it's India, whether Indonesia, many other countries. Wherever the rapid growing country, they also simultaneously witness rising income inequality. But Vietnam is one of the unique experience. Not only they achieved rapid economic growth, they also reduced extreme poverty almost to zero, and also able to reduce modest level income inequality also. So therefore there is a lot we can learn from Vietnam experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica. I know you have to go because you have an important meeting to attend. So I'm now going to give the floor to Xavier for some reactions to the comments made by the panelists.
Thank you very much. I would, first of all, like to thank the members of the panel for joining us today and for sharing their thoughts with us. You did not hear this morning, as findings of our report, policy recommendations, because that was not the point. We spent 3 years of our work getting into contact, thinking, co-building with local populations, local communities about their situation. And today we are starting to think about the policy translation of the analysis that was carried out over the past 3 years. Now, you all underlined the necessary role of labor market institutes. Our research shows that exploitation of workers still exists both in the global north and the global south. People who work in undignified jobs people who are not respected at work, who cannot make a living from their work. Now, there are also some success stories. An initiative in France with 0 unemployment regions. This initiative aims at bringing together in a region people who were considered as unemployable because there's money out there. There are enough jobs for everyone, and everyone has skills that can be valued. And so by bringing everyone together, this has been a very strong success story in some regions in France, and the hope is to extend the experience elsewhere. And then you also mentioned social protection systems. French social protection, I believe, covers about 95% of the population. In Tanzania, it might be around 15%. So there are extreme gaps in coverage, and coverage is progressing thanks to coalitions, and that is a good thing. However, we also know that when we listen to our partners from the South, they say that lacking social protection is especially hard on poorest families, whereas in our country, social protection is strong, but this gives rise to institutional maltreatment. And benefiting from social benefits can be a punitive experience for people in richer countries. And Jean-Paul gave us information on participatory projects. I'm very happy to learn that we are state-of-the-art researchers. I think it's necessary to have more academics working in this type of participatory research. It was very difficult for us to be heard at the beginning. I'd like to thank everyone who came on board. There weren't many of them. It's still very difficult to attract academics to this type of project. And I wanted to conclude on a final aspect. We've mentioned the word participation, and I think it is valid at every single level. Labor market institutions should also be assessed in a participatory manner with the help of the poorest populations. The same goes for social protection systems. We need to listen to people in the UK who feel punished when they are job seekers. If we don't listen to the people who are the first affected, then we will never be able to improve these institutions. And I also wanted to mention another point. What Alison Tate said was very relevant. When you ask people why they are not unionized, they say it's because nobody has reached out to us. I think this needs to be improved. In Bangladesh, we had people who reached out to Tiger Widows, to other groups, and all of our research teams across all of the countries made an extraordinary effort to reach out to people who they were not in contact with regularly. And I think the motto of the SDGs, leave no one behind. We need to live this, and we need to act on this. Now, as a conclusion, partnering up with poor people is an individual effort, but it's also a collective effort. It goes through social mobilization. And at ATD Fourth World, we need to say this out loud. If we had not brought together poor populations, researchers, academics, then we would never have this type of project. So we needed the social movement at the origin. These social movements and civil society organizations are necessary to bring forward the voice of the poorest, to make their voice heard, and ultimately to make a difference. So I think that each and every one of us should also become social activists. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup à nos deux.
Thank you very much to everyone on both our panels from this morning. Thanks to the two discussants that we heard. We scanned a large horizon this morning on the findings of your research, the measure aspects, and the action action aspect, which is still at the very beginning, since your research did not have as a purpose to draft recommendations for policy action. But I am very inspired, and there will be a report presented by the group of experts to the UN Secretary General. And I'm very hopeful that this idea of participatory research become more and more present. Jean-Paul, what you said is true. And I think it also reflects the 2030 agenda. We need to put people at the heart of the agenda. Leaving no one behind means exactly that, that people who are the first concerned, the first affected, need to be at the heart of discussions and action. The 2030 agenda is an aspirational, universal framework which applies to all countries. But if it is applied in an abstract manner, if it's changed into a beauty context with reports on the 17 goals and the targets and the indicators, then I think that will not make a single difference. What we need to see is that each country, city, region, each community takes ownership of this 2030 agenda in order to translate it into real life improvements for people on the ground. Now, regarding indicators and policies, we can't just say that more should be invested in education or in health. I think it is through differentiated, targeted approach, different from country to country, different from population to population. I was struck by one of the examples from the U.S. Cohort with dropout children. The issue isn't so much enrolling them in school. That won't guarantee a success or performance. And it's not if you have indicators of school enrollment that you'll see better performance. The issue is how to solve the problems of both parents and children in these communities. So I think this morning was very enlightening.